The year was 3030. The Earth had long since evolved into a place where technology surpassed even the wildest imaginations of the ancients. Hovercrafts zipped across the skies, towering cities floated on clouds, and artificial intelligences ran everything, from the smallest convenience store to the sprawling metropolises that stretched beyond the horizon. Yet, despite all the advancements, there remained one thing in short supply: time. In this world, time wasn't something you could measure with a watch or track on a calendar. No, time had become a marketable commodity, bought, sold, and traded as though it were gold, but far more precious. Those who had time lived forever, while those who didn't, well, they vanished as quickly as they had appeared. It was in this world that a peculiar figure made his name, the time merchant. A man, or perhaps something more than a man, with the ability to travel across centuries, cut through timelines, and broker deals that affected not just individuals, but the very fabric of reality itself. He dealt in futures, pasts, and all the moments in between, offering those desperate enough to trust him a glimpse of what lay ahead, for a price. But today, he wasn't here to make a deal with some poor, confused soul. Today, he had a contract to deliver, one that would change the fate of a man who had lived 1,000 years. The office was dim, the air thick with the smell of old books and exotic herbs. A grand desk stretched across the room, its wood darkened with age. Behind it sat old Wang, a man so ancient that his wrinkles had wrinkles of their own. His hair, once black, now flowed like silver threads down to his shoulders, and his eyes, though clouded by time, still sparkled with the wisdom of centuries. He sat, leaning back in his chair, sipping from a cup of liquid that no one could identify. His fingers, though bent with age, still moved with the deftness of a younger man. He was not a stranger to visitors, but today's visitor was different. Today, he had no idea who he was dealing with. A soft click echoed through the room as the door opened, and in stepped the time merchant. He was a striking figure, tall, with sharp features that didn't quite belong to any era. His clothes were a mix of sleek futuristic fabrics, stitched with threads that glowed faintly under the light. He wore a smile that was equal parts charming and unsettling. "Good afternoon, old Wang," the merchant said, his voice smooth as polished marble. Wang looked up, his face crinkling into a smile. "You have a lot of nerve, young man. What brings you here?" "The last time someone tried to sell me a contract, they got a quick lesson in how to age gracefully." His tone was teasing, but there was a flicker of wariness in his eyes. The time merchant chuckled, walking slowly toward the desk. He pulled from his coat a thin, glowing sheet of paper, which he placed delicately in front of Wang. "This is no ordinary contract," the merchant said, his voice low and serious. "This is a contract from your future self." Wang raised an eyebrow. He was accustomed to all sorts of strange claims, but this one caught his attention. "My future self? I'm not sure I believe in such things. I've lived 1,000 years. I've seen what the future holds. I'm my own man. I don't need some piece of paper to tell me what I'm going to do next." The merchant's smile deepened, as if he had been expecting this reaction. "I understand. But I'm afraid this contract doesn't give you much of a choice." Wang laughed, shaking his head. "If this is some sort of joke, you're wasting both of our time. I've had enough of being fooled by false promises. If you've come to sell me something, you'll have to try harder." But the time merchant wasn't deterred. He extended his hand, and with a flick of his wrist, a hologram appeared, flickering in the air. It was an image of Wang, not as he was now, but as he would be in the distant future. He was sitting at a table, much like the one in front of him, a pen in his hand. And before him lay the same glowing contract. Wang froze. The image was so lifelike, so real, that he could feel the weight of it. He knew this was no trick, no illusion. This was something he could not ignore. The hologram flickered again, showing a series of events that led to the same moment, his hand moving to sign the contract, his expression resigned yet certain. "Impossible," Wang muttered, leaning forward. He could feel the cold edge of disbelief creeping into his voice. What? What is this? The time merchant's voice softened, his tone becoming almost sympathetic. You'll sign it, old Wang. You already have. Wang recoiled, his heart suddenly racing. I haven't signed anything. I don't even know what it says. The merchant leaned in closer, his smile unwavering. It doesn't matter if you understand it or not. You will sign it, just as you always do. For the first time, Wang felt a chill run down his spine. No. No, this is madness. The time merchant placed his hand on the contract, and it flickered to life, its words shifting and changing. A series of terms appeared in front of Wang's eyes, flashing in a language he didn't quite recognize. But one phrase stood out: by signing this contract, you agree to surrender your future in exchange for eternal peace. What is this nonsense? Wang snapped, his voice trembling. I don't need peace. I've seen it all, and I've made my own choices. I won't be bound by some future version of myself. The merchant stepped back, his hands raised in mock surrender. I'm afraid you don't have a choice. You see, this contract isn't just a piece of paper. It's tied to you, to your very essence. Every time you try to reject it, the timeline shifts. Your decisions are being guided by forces you cannot comprehend. You're already on the path that leads to this moment. You always will be. Wang's mind raced. He had lived 1,000 years, yet he felt as though he was standing at the edge of something he couldn't understand. Something ancient, something beyond his control. No, he shouted. I will not sign this. I will not be controlled by anyone, not even by myself. But the contract glowed brighter, and with each passing second, it seemed to pull him in, to draw him closer. It was as if the universe itself was conspiring to make him sign. Why? Wang asked, his voice hoarse. Why would my future self want this? Why would I ever agree to such a thing? The time merchant's smile faded, replaced by a look of pity. You may not understand now, but soon you will. This contract was created for you, old Wang. It's your fate. And I'm afraid you have no choice but to accept it. Wang stood, his legs trembling. He reached out, his fingers brushing the edges of the contract. As soon as he touched it, his body seemed to pulse with energy. The room around him began to distort, warping and shifting like a fever dream. Before he knew it, the world around him went dark. When Wang's senses returned, he found himself standing at the center of a vast, empty plain. There was no sky, no horizon, only an endless stretch of nothingness. The air felt strangely thin, as if the very fabric of time itself was slipping through his fingers. The time merchant was beside him, though his presence felt like a distant echo rather than something immediate. He had vanished momentarily, but now he was back, walking around in circles like a man inspecting the cracks in the world. Where are we? Wang's voice was hoarse, strained from the shock, but there was no denying the panic creeping in. This is the threshold, the merchant said, his voice light but tinged with an undertone of finality. The space between moments. You've crossed the boundary now. The contract is in motion, old Wang. It's guiding us. We've only just begun. Guiding us? Wang could feel the panic rising in his chest again, and he clenched his fists. I don't want to be guided. I want answers. I want to know why my future self is trying to trap me. The time merchant stopped and looked at him, his eyes dark and unreadable. You don't need to know everything. Some things must remain a mystery. You'll find out what you need to in time. The rest is irrelevant. The rest is irrelevant? Wang laughed bitterly, the sound hollow in the empty space. That's rich coming from someone who's been selling people's futures for a living. You don't care about people's choices, do you? You care about making sure they follow the paths you've set out for them. Paths you get paid for. How much does my contract cost you, merchant? Is it worth what you're doing to me? The merchant's lips quirked upward in a slight smile. You'll find that the cost of such things isn't as straightforward as you think. The real cost isn't in currency, old Wang. It's in the moments that could have been. The paths that could have unfolded if you'd taken a different step, signed a different piece of paper. If you'd made a different decision. Wang felt a cold sensation crawl up his spine. He'd seen many things over his long life, far more than most could ever imagine. But this was different. Something about the way the merchant spoke, the way he seemed to know more than Wang himself could, unsettled him deeply enough with the riddles. Wang's voice cracked. Just tell me what I have to do to break this contract, to get back to my own life. The time merchant's expression softened. You can't break it, old Wang. You're already living the consequences of your own choices. The moment you signed, you sealed it. I didn't sign it. Wang shouted, his voice raw with frustration. I didn't. You manipulated me. You tricked me. I'm not supposed to sign a thing like that. It's not me. The merchant stepped closer, his presence commanding yet strangely comforting. It is you. Every choice you've made, every regret, every moment of indecision, they all led you here. This contract was written long ago, in a time before you could even understand what it meant. Your future self, the one who will sign it, already exists, and you can't escape what's already been. Wang took a step back, shaking his head in disbelief. Then what are we doing here? What's the point of dragging me through this? The point is simple, the merchant said, his tone matter of fact. You need to understand that time isn't linear. It's a web. The future you saw isn't fixed. It can be altered. But not by you alone. You need the key. Wang's brow furrowed. The key? What key? The key of timelines, the merchant replied. It's an artifact hidden somewhere in the future. It can undo the contract's grip. But it's not an easy thing to find. The timeline has been shaped by your decisions, old Wang. It won't let you go that easily. The word artifact echoed in Wang's mind like a strange chord struck on an old instrument. So this is some kind of treasure hunt, then? You're sending me after some mythical key in a world that's already collapsing around me? The merchant nodded slowly. Exactly. But it's not just the world that's at risk here. It's you. And once you understand how the contract works, you'll know why finding the key is the only way out. Before Wang could respond, the world around them shifted again, this time more violently. The ground beneath their feet trembled, and the nothingness seemed to give way to a new landscape, a sprawling city that was a mishmash of old and new. Towering skyscrapers that reached into the clouds, their windows cracked and dirty. Streets lined with neon signs, flickering in the smog-filled air. People moved about, some in hurried strides, others aimlessly wandering like ghosts. Time itself felt fractured here, as if the very passage of seconds was skipping over moments. They had arrived in the future that was meant to be. Where are we? Wang's voice was a whisper, almost afraid to ask. This is one of many futures, the merchant answered cryptically. A possibility. A version of what could be. But it's not the one that matters. Not yet. Wang looked around, feeling a strange sense of vertigo as the world pulsed with the disjointed rhythm of a place where time was fragmented. There were whispers in the air, voices that felt both familiar and foreign. It was as if the past, present, and future were colliding in this one space, creating something entirely new and unsettling. You said we need the key, Wang said slowly, forcing himself to focus. Where do we start looking? The merchant grinned. That's the first question you need to ask yourself. The key isn't something you can find just by wandering. It's hidden deep within the timeline. You must follow the threads, make the right choices. They will lead you to it. Wang nodded, though doubt lingered in the pit of his stomach. And if I fail? Then this future becomes your reality. And that future will not be kind to you. Wang swallowed hard. It felt like the weight of 1,000 years was pressing down on him. But there was no turning back now. He had signed the contract, had walked through the door, and now the only way out was forward. The merchant turned to him, his expression now unreadable. You must understand this, old Wang, time is both the chain and the key. The contract you signed is a part of you, a manifestation of your choices. It was never about what the future wanted. It was always about what you chose. Wang's mind raced. He thought back to all the choices he had made, the decisions that had shaped his life. Was this the result of his mistakes? His fears? Had he unknowingly set this course in motion? But before he could dig deeper into his thoughts, the merchant beckoned him to follow. Time is already moving faster now. We must act quickly. The key won't wait for us forever. Wang had no choice but to follow. As they walked through the fractured city, the strange, disjointed nature of time became more pronounced. Buildings shifted shape before their eyes, roads twisted and turned in impossible ways, and the people they passed seemed to exist in multiple versions of themselves, as if time was folding in on itself. It was here, in this chaotic, fractured future, that Wang knew he would either find the key that could free him from the contract or be swallowed up by the very timeline he had once taken for granted. They stopped in front of an old, rusted building, its sign flickering with a barely legible name. The air felt heavy here, as if the weight of all the timelines had settled in this one place. This is where it begins, the merchant said, his voice low and almost reverent. Wang took a deep breath, his heart pounding in his chest. He had no idea what he would find inside. But one thing was certain, whatever came next would determine whether he could escape the future that had been written for him, or become just another lost soul in the web of time. The time merchant stepped forward, opening the door. Inside, the darkness swallowed them whole. The door creaked open, and the darkness inside the building was thick, like a blanket that smothered every sound. Wang took a hesitant step forward, the floor beneath his feet groaning in protest, as if the very structure was reluctant to harbor them. The time merchant, unfazed, stepped inside without a second thought, his silhouette swallowed by the shadows. Stay close, the merchant's voice echoed back to him, distant and cold, despite the proximity. This place bends time in strange ways. Don't stray. Wang nodded, though he wasn't sure if the merchant's words meant anything anymore. Nothing made sense in this future, this fractured, unpredictable reality. It felt as if every step they took was a ripple in a pond that would never settle, an endless disruption that refused to find any peace. They continued forward, the only sound their footsteps and the occasional rustling of something unseen in the dark. After what felt like an eternity, the room ahead of them slowly revealed itself. Faint lights flickered to life in the ceiling, casting weak, wavering shadows over stacks of old papers, broken equipment, and strange artifacts that seemed to pulse with a life of their own. The room was cluttered, but not in the usual sense. This wasn't the kind of chaos you'd find in an abandoned attic or a forgotten warehouse. This was chaos forged in time, a place where things had been left, waiting for the right moment to reappear, or be lost forever. Here, the merchant said softly, drawing Wang's attention to a large pedestal in the center of the room. It was made of some material Wang didn't recognize, and atop it rested an object, a key. But it wasn't like any key Wang had ever seen. It was long and intricate, shimmering with iridescent light, as if it were made from fragments of time itself. It seemed to move in the light, bending and shifting in ways that defied logic. It was beautiful, haunting, and entirely alien. Wang approached cautiously, his breath catching as he studied the key. There was something unsettling about it, something that made his skin crawl. It was as if the key itself held memories, his memories. As if, by simply being near it, he could feel all the versions of himself that had led him to this moment. And all the versions that hadn't. You feel it, don't you? The time merchant's voice broke through his thoughts, and Wang turned to see him watching from the shadows, a strange intensity in his gaze. The key is more than just a tool. It's a manifestation of all the choices you've made, or will make. A convergence of all the paths that time has offered you. You're standing at the crossroads, old Wang. Wang didn't reply. He was frozen, the weight of the decision ahead of him pressing down on him. Could this key truly undo the contract? Could it sever the threads of fate that had entangled him? Or was it another piece of the merchant's manipulation? After all, the future had already been set in motion. Every turn of events had led him to this point. Every choice had been made for him, by his future self, by the contract, by the merchant. How much of it was truly his own? Take it, the merchant urged, his voice soft, almost coaxing. It's yours to claim. Wang reached out, his fingers brushing the key's surface. The moment he made contact, the room around him shuddered, and everything seemed to warp. Time, once again, began to break apart. The walls pulsed and flickered, shifting between different ages and places. One moment, he was surrounded by neon signs and crumbling skyscrapers. The next, he was standing in the ruins of an ancient city, lost to time. Each pulse carried with it a fragment of a possible future, a piece of a path he might have taken. The key hummed beneath his touch, vibrating with power. His mind reeled, his thoughts a whirlwind of uncertainty. The future that had already been written for him, hung in the balance. Was this the moment to alter everything? Or would it be another mistake, another path that led him deeper into the labyrinth of time? You must decide, the merchant said, his voice growing more distant, as if it were coming from another place. The key is yours, but it's not just a tool to unlock the past. It's a decision. It will force you to face the consequences of everything you've ever done, everything you will do. Wang's heart pounded in his chest. He could feel the pull of the key, drawing him in, urging him to make a choice. To claim it. To undo the contract, to break the cycle that had trapped him. But what if the price was higher than he could pay? I don't want to do this, Wang whispered, though he wasn't sure if he was speaking to the merchant or to himself. I don't want to choose anymore. I've made so many choices, so many mistakes. What if I'm wrong? What if this is another trap? The merchant's figure emerged from the shadows, his face unreadable. Then the cycle will continue. The future will unfold as it always has. The contract will hold you. You'll live out your days in this fractured world, forever tied to the choices that were never really yours. The words hit Wang like a physical blow. His mind spun. He had already felt the weight of time, the burden of 1,000 years lived in constant motion, always in pursuit of something just out of reach. Every step had led him here, to this moment of ultimate choice. But would breaking free be enough? Could he truly escape the threads of destiny that bound him? You see, old Wang, the merchant said, stepping closer. This isn't just about you. It's about all the versions of you, the ones who made choices, the ones who didn't. You've lived 1,000 years, but you've never truly lived outside the confines of the contract. It's time to decide if you will be the one to rewrite your future, or if you'll let someone else do it for you. Wang felt the weight of those words settle over him. Could he truly change everything? Could he free himself from the cycle of time that had bound him for so long? Or was he destined to live forever in the web of fate, where each decision only led him further into the future he had already seen? He stared at the key, at the shimmering surface that seemed to pulse with every heartbeat. It was beautiful and terrifying, its power overwhelming. He reached for it again, this time with a steadiness in his hand, a resolve he hadn't known he had. If there was one thing he had learned in 1,000 years, it was that time was a merciless force. But it was also fluid. It could be bent, reshaped, and rewritten. With a final breath, Wang took the key. The moment his fingers wrapped around it, the world around him cracked open like glass, shattering into a million pieces. Time itself bent and twisted, each shard of reality flickering and disappearing, only to be replaced by something new. Something freed. He closed his eyes against the chaos, but when he opened them again, the world had changed. The room was still there, the pedestal still standing, but everything was different. The darkness was gone. The walls were no longer pulsing with time's fractured rhythm. The air felt thicker, more solid, as if reality had finally settled. Wang took a step forward, the key still in his hand, and for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was truly in control. He wasn't bound by the contract. He wasn't bound by fate. He was free. The time merchant stood in the corner, watching him with a curious expression. There was no smugness now, no amusement. Only a deep, knowing silence. Wang looked at him, his voice steady. "I've made my choice." The merchant nodded slowly. "You have. But remember, old Wang, time doesn't let go so easily. The future will always pull at you. But you have the power to decide what comes next. That's what makes you different." Wang didn't say anything more. He didn't need to. The future was his to shape now. The key was his, and with it, he could forge a new path, one that wasn't dictated by contracts, by merchants, or by any version of himself. For the first time in 1,000 years, Wang was truly free. And that was enough.